technologies, such as Symantec's Bloodhound technology, which try and look for virus-like characteristics. But if you talk to any VXer worth their salts, they'll tell you that all of these mechanisms are pretty trivial to circumvent. And again, sandbox runtime analysis environments we've already mentioned are really focused around answering the question of what the code does. So there's clearly a lot of R&D associated with modern antivirus and analysis technologies. Most of these technologies are designed to give us a 1 or a 0 in terms of telling us, is this bad or isn't it? Specifically in the case of antivirus. If you look at a lot of sandbox-based utilities, they'll tell us what the code does, but they don't really tell us how they achieve that, or provide any mechanism or insight into the merits or demerits of how the code's been implemented. And there's a lot of, and therefore there's a lot of metadata that gets processed by many of these tools under the hood, but none of that data is really exposed to the end user, so we can make good use of it for attribution efforts. And because of that, there's a real need to either adapt the existing tool set, or build new tools which are more geared around the attribution question. So changing gears for a second, attribution is a topic which I've been studying with a bunch of folks around the Beltway in DC for probably about 9 or 10 years now. And we've had a bunch of working groups with members from 3-letter agencies, large organizations like Microsoft, to really try and answer the question of how can we start building data models around characterizing the adversary. Not necessarily the problem of attribution head-on, but how do we start describing a set of adversarial traits. And so this is one of the models that we came up with, where you have basically 3 major properties that we try and analyze. You've got the environment, and that's the environment that surrounds all of us, around the target, around the attacker. And 2 really important relationships, and that's the motivation and the capability between the attacker and the target. And without a motivation and with capability, there's not really a threat to your systems. With capability and no motivation, again, there's not really any threat to your system. So one of the things that we try to use this model for is what variables are required in this model based on who your organization is to really consider an attacker to be a threat to your systems. And what we're not looking at here is a low-end adversary. What we're really looking at is, okay, we've got a generic security posture, we've put all these things in place, we've got IDSs, we've got IPSs, we've got all the snake oil that the security industry can throw at us. Now we're worried about the guys that are really going to break into our network, that are serious players and going to break into our systems. How are they going to break in? And what are their variables going to look like? So one of the things that we try and observe is the inhibitors associated with an attack. So what thought process does an attacker go through before launching any attack? What's the payoff given success? What's their perceived probability of success? What's going to happen to them if they're attributed and detected? And what do we think their uncertainty regarding the parameters of the attack will be? And of course, another thing that we're looking at, given each information system that we might be considering, is what's motivating them to attack this system in the first place. Are they trying to steal source code? Do we think they're trying to steal social security numbers? What is it that's really driving them to execute the attack in the first place? Obviously, the probability of success is often a major motivator for a lot of attackers. If someone thinks that they're highly likely to break into a system, they're more likely to want to execute that attack. And again, what are the perceived consequences of failure? It's a bit of an odd one, which you don't normally think about, but a lot of the studies we've shown, especially with a lot of the folks that I've spoken to that deal with a lot of the issues in the Asia-Pacific Rim, it's a very real consequence that someone may be recruited into a state-sponsored program and told that if you don't do this for your country, we're going to make sure that your family never works again. There may be physical intimidation. So that's another thing that you have to consider when looking at the mindset of why an attacker engages in an attack in the first place. And so this brings us on to being able to rate the attack based off of various metadata that we can observe. So again, this research that we're presenting now is about 5 years old, but I'm showing it to you just to give us a basis for the analysis that we're going to do in a few minutes. So we were looking at key attack metadata, such as the sources of attack. As a lot of you will know, the IP address of where an attack is coming from is of limited merit for high-end attacks these days. Other relevant packet data, such as the operating system that the adversary is using, may not be their own system, but if you talk to a lot of attackers, they'll tell you that the systems that they break into on the internet to act as bounce hosts will generally be operating systems that they're more comfortable using. No one wants to break into some old IRX box that doesn't have a compiler on it because it doesn't have a license, and that's no good to anyone. So the operating systems that are being used to attack systems are also of interest to us. And then what was the methodology behind the attack? Is there any observable planning that we could see that occurred? What was the score of the execution? And how was the follow-through? What was it that they did once they were in the system? And actually, on the point of planning, Dave Attell posted an interesting note to Daily Dave the other day, or maybe a few weeks ago, on just this point, that a lot of the high-end attacks that we see these days are so advanced that the only chance we often have to stop them is by identifying the attacks during the planning stages. So these three phases of the attack really are very important to analyze, so that we can, even if we did get hacked into, maybe we can now develop signatures so that we'll see the planning in the future. And once we've analyzed the methodology, this then brings us on to the individual attack tools that got leveraged during an attack. So every attack tool comes from somewhere. There's a lot of hard work that goes into writing exploits. Anyone that's written an exploit these days will tell you that there's a lot of late nights that get involved in, especially circumventing a lot of the modern mechanisms, such as hardware DEP and ASLR. But you can split those into two primary categories, those which are public and those which only exist in the private domain. And one of the first things we might try and do with any attack is try and establish whether the tool exists publicly, or we think that it was something that the attacker developed themselves with the specific purpose of attacking our systems. And the major difference between these two subsets, if you look at a lot of attack tools, is that the public exploits which exist out there generally are only designed to prove a concept. So someone's written it just to prove that this really is a real vulnerability. A lot of the time vendors won't pay any attention to you unless you develop some kind of proof of concept to show that it can pop a shell under certain environments. And because of that, they're often not very reliable in terms of attacking a diverse set of targets. So you'll find that, for example, MSRPC overflow may only work on a very specific version of Vista with a certain service pack and maybe language pack installed. Whereas those which exist privately are generally a lot better written. People have a tendency to invest a lot more time in things that aren't going to be shared openly on the internet. Are generally better written and are often based off of attack APIs which are private to the individual or group which they're working within. And by attack API, we're really talking about private versions of things like Metasploit, which facilitate in the exploit writing process, whether that be building shellcode or a system call proxy, and identifying potentially from the attack if we think a public API was used or if we think that they've grown something themselves. And in the case that we have access to the tool, either through it being public or through it being private and some other intelligence source, we'll then want to consider a number of things. So how easy was it for the adversary to use that attack tool? Was a lot of prior technical knowledge required to use the tool? Did they need a lot of information about the target host, or did it do self-enumeration of the remote service pack, operating system, and so forth, or was it more of a point-and-click kind of deal? And was it appropriate for a given task? You hear all these statistics about how many billion attacks the DoD receives every year and so forth, and the fact is a lot of those are automated attacks of some kind, and if you can take that population of attacks and filter out all of those which were stupid things like IIS exploits being fired against Apache servers and so forth, you're probably going to slim that sample size down significantly. and give you something more manageable to analyze. So as a progression of that, we then came up with these various attack matrices to analyze various types of exploits against systems. So this is just an example for web applications. Different organizations may weight these differently based on the types of assets you're trying to protect, but this gives you a basic example of how you might be able to automate creating a scoring matrix to rate an attack based on whether the exploit use was public or private, or at least whether the vulnerability being exploited was in the public domain or something homegrown. In the case of applications, was it a proprietary application that you've written yourselves, or is it something that the adversary can go and download from the internet? So it's clear that there's a large body of analysis research which exists within the public domain, which we can rely on to help develop our analysis tool set further. And as we mentioned previously, most of this is geared around traditional incident response. And in a lot of cases, it's just not appropriate for attribution. And there's a lot of people out there who are mostly in good faith trying to perform attribution using tools a lot of the time which really aren't appropriate, and drawing conclusions which aren't necessarily accurate, or at very least they may be accurate, but they really don't have any technical backing to substantiate the research. So there's a clear need for reduction in the guesswork. We need to make the topic of attribution more of a science and less of an art form. We need people speculating less and relying more on substantiated information which we can build a body of research on as a security community. And we need common attribution models that different organizations and different researchers can use to communicate information about attackers, about attacks, and about attack patterns to each other, so that we're all playing from the same sheet. So I just wanted to mention a couple of technologies which have started doing this already. And there's clearly a lot of science behind profiling of criminals. Behavioral science is a huge topic area of which I don't have much experience, but a number of the folks that were involved in the research that we were performing in the early days do have clinical psychology PhDs. One of them was a very interesting guy by the name of Eric Shaw, who's still in the community today, and he spent a good 20 years at CIA, and he's now a private researcher. And he came up with a technology called Warm Touch. And what Warm Touch did was it takes the idea of linguistics analysis and automates it in a way in which we can use it to identify potential future adversarial acts from an individual within a large company. So the example that he always gave me was if you were married and you're asking your wife to call in the kids for dinner, there's three ways that you could do that. You could say, darling, can you call Jane and Jim in for dinner? Or darling, can you call the kids in for dinner? Or darling, can you call those kids in for dinner? That's three variant levels of hostility towards your children that you're probably not thinking about at the time. But it exemplifies how we can spot things like that through behavioral and language analysis to identify potential future adversarial efforts against an organization. And he calls this Warm Touch. And very similarly to the matrices that we just described, he came up with a similar mechanism that basically sits on mail servers and spots potential future aggression towards an individual that's the subject of a conversation, the person that the email's to, or any potential anxiety that the individual may be feeling. And in actual fact, has used the technology very successfully in, I think, 1999, 2000, somewhere around then. A Russian national tried to extort Michael Bloomberg for $20,000, I think it was. And what happened is they were able to email back and forth with this guy, and as most of you probably know, the US doesn't have an extradition agreement with Russia. So they had to find some way to get him to the UK. And the way that they did this was to eventually make him an offer, but they waited to a point where they were able to observe that his anxiety levels were at a certain level, and that he would be more amenable to an offer to fly to London, where perhaps he was aware that he maybe get